By the early 1930s, the country was changing again. This time not with excitement, but with dust. The Great Plains dried up, the wheat fields failed, and the wind carried the topsoil straight into the sky. Whole counties went dark at noon. Farms that had fed generations turned into gray wastelands overnight, and when there was nothing left to plant or sell, families packed what they could onto trucks and started driving west. For most of them, that road was Route 66. It was the only highway that led all the way to California. A thread of hope running through Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, before finally reaching the green valleys of the coast. You could follow those old black and white photos like a map. Pickups piled high with furniture, mattresses tied down with rope, kids riding in the dust behind, and the words California or bust chalked onto the tailgate. It wasn't a joyride. Engines overheated on the desert climbs, tires shredded on hot asphalt that could melt the soles of your shoes. Families slept in their trucks at the edge of fields or in makeshift camps called Hoovervilles. But every mile west felt like a mile closer to something better, and Route 66 carried them there, one rattle and cough at a time. John Steinbeck watched that migration and gave it a name the whole world would remember: the Mother Road. In The Grapes of Wrath, he wrote about that ribbon of highway as if it were alive, a path of sorrow and survival, winding through America's hardest years. And he wasn't exaggerating. For the folks who drove it, Route 66 wasn't just asphalt. It was the only thing standing between them and starvation. Along the way, small towns learned how to take care of the weary. Churches handed out meals. Locals sold cheap fuel and flat tires at oaky prices, sometimes out of kindness, sometimes just to make a sale. The highway filled with motor courts, tiny cabins with screen doors and a single light bulb, where a night's rest cost $1 or $2. Roadside diners popped up, serving hamburgers for a nickel and thick coffee poured from steel pots that never seemed to run empty. Those little businesses kept whole communities alive. Mechanics worked through the night fixing engines held together with wire and luck. Kids sold cold soda bottles out of tubs packed with ice. And as traffic grew, towns started painting their names on rooftops so drivers knew they were coming to a place that still had something to offer. The road itself took on a kind of personality: cracked, sunburned, stubborn. You could follow the smell of oil and sagebrush all the way from Oklahoma City to Barstow, California. The pavement shimmered in the heat, and sometimes it felt like you were driving across a mirage. But if you kept your eyes straight ahead, the horizon always promised one more town, one more chance. Route 66 became the backbone of a hungry, hurting country. A lifeline stretched across the middle of America. And when the storms finally settled, and the factories started hiring again, that same road that had carried desperation would soon carry something brand new: prosperity. When the Great Depression finally eased its grip, the next great movement on Route 66 wasn't driven by desperation, but by war. Factories roared back to life, and the quiet towns that had once handed out bread were now building airplanes, trucks, and tanks. The same road that carried the hungry West now carried the soldiers, welders, and dreamers who were going to change the world. In the early 1940s, Route 66 turned into a military lifeline. Convoys of olive-drab trucks rumbled across the plains day and night, headlights blacked out under wartime orders. Busloads of recruits rode west toward boot camps and bases, singing, smoking, and wondering what lay ahead. In Oklahoma City, you could stand on the sidewalk and watch hundreds of military vehicles pass: jeeps, half-tracks, and tank haulers, all heading toward the Pacific coast. Every town along the route felt the tremor of that mobilization. Small motels filled with GIs and factory workers. Gas stations stayed open around the clock. In Albuquerque and Amarillo, defense plants and airfields sprang up almost overnight, bringing steady paychecks to people who had spent a decade scraping by. Housewives took welding jobs. Teenagers pumped gas for soldiers. Cafe owners hung American flags in the window and painted "We serve our boys" on the glass. The road itself got some long overdue attention, too. Federal crews repaved stretches that had been chewed up by Depression-era trucks. Bridges were reinforced to carry heavier military loads. The government didn't call it patriotism. They called it logistics. But everyone knew the truth. Route 66 was as important to the war effort as any ship or plane. Rationing made travel different. Tires, gas, and even sugar were precious. Still, the spirit of the road endured. Truckers swapped stories over black coffee. Families with ration coupons still packed into Fords to visit loved ones in training camps. You could tell who was military by the uniform and who wasn't by the grease under their nails. But on 66, everyone was part of the same mission. From Chicago to Santa Monica, the old highway tied together America's two halves, the industrial heartland that built the war machine and the coastal ports that sent it overseas. It carried hope in both directions, men going out to fight, and goods coming back to rebuild. When the war finally ended, the soldiers came home down that same road, this time with the wind in their hair and the idea that maybe, just maybe, it was time to see what all those miles had to offer. When the war ended, the soldiers came home to a country they barely recognized. The factories that had once built tanks now rolled out cars in chrome and color. Highways that had carried convoys were open again to families, and Route 66, still humming from the wartime rush, was waiting. By the late 1940s, America was restless. People had money in their pockets, gas in the tank, and a brand new curiosity about what lay beyond their hometown. Route 66 was the answer. A single thread you could follow all the way from the Great Lakes to the Pacific, watching the country unfold one diner, one motel, one gas station at a time. The road itself changed with the times. The old gravel and concrete slabs were replaced with smoother asphalt, painted with fresh center lines that stretched like golden arrows toward the horizon. The cars were bigger now, Buicks with white wall tires, Chevys with tail fins, station wagons packed with kids and suitcases tied to the roof. Every family had a folding map in the glove box and a thermos full of coffee in the front seat. Small-town entrepreneurs saw the future rolling toward them and got to work. They built motels shaped like teepees, cafes shaped like airplanes, and neon signs so bright they lit up the desert night. Each one begged for a photo or a pit stop. Gas stations offered clean restrooms like it was a badge of honor. You could fill up your tank, your stomach, and your camera roll without ever leaving the highway. Some places became legends all their own. In Illinois, the Chain of Rocks Bridge arched gracefully across the Mississippi, carrying travelers from St. Louis into the wide-open West. Its odd 15-degree bend halfway across the span made every driver sit up straight at the wheel. Down in Oklahoma, the blue whale of Catoosa rose from a roadside pond, a smiling sky-blue sculpture built by a local man for his grandchildren. Before long, it became one of the most photographed stops on the route. In Texas, you couldn't miss the Cadillac Ranch outside Amarillo. 10 classic cars half buried nose first in the dirt, their tail fins jutting up like a row of metallic sunflowers. What started as an art prank turned into one of the most iconic Route 66 landmarks of all time. Further west, in Arizona, the Wigwam Motel gave travelers the chance to sleep in a teepee, a circle of concrete cones that glowed warm under the neon. And at the far end of it all, the Santa Monica Pier waited like a prize ribbon on the ocean's edge, where countless travelers posed beneath the sign marking the end of Route 66. But the real magic wasn't in the landmarks. It was in the rhythm of the trip itself. Every few miles brought another diner with a different slice of pie, another small-town main street, where kids waved at passing cars. You could stop at a trading post in New Mexico, buy a snakeskin belt, and an hour later be in Arizona eating chili under a Coca-Cola sign that hummed in the evening heat. Television and radio sealed the deal. Nat King Cole's smooth voice turned the highway into a melody. Get your kicks on Route 66. The TV show that followed in the early 60s made it a household name, showing two young men cruising America in a shiny Corvette, chasing adventure and meaning down that same stretch of road. The highway became shorthand for freedom, the open sky, the radio up loud, and the idea that life could change just by heading west. For the people who lived along it, Route 66 wasn't just pavement. It was livelihood. Mechanics kept garages open 7 days a week because somebody was always breaking down. Families ran diners where the smell of bacon and coffee never stopped. Motels stayed family-owned for decades, their neon signs promising vacancy to the next weary driver. Whole towns owed their existence to that steady stream of travelers. Truckers carried freight, honeymooners took Polaroids, servicemen drove west with their wives to start fresh in California's booming suburbs. The road gave everyone the same promise. No matter where you started, you could keep going. Route 66 was the pulse of post-war America, a symbol of what the country wanted to believe about itself. Young, mobile, full of optimism. From the red brick of St. Louis to the dusty sunsets of the Mojave, every mile told the same story, that freedom wasn't a destination, it was a drive. For nearly 3 decades, the Mother Road carried America's dreams. And then, slowly, progress caught up. The same spirit that built it. The drive for something faster, bigger, and more efficient would become the very thing that started to erase it. For a long while, it felt like Route 66 would run forever. The signs were bright, the cars kept coming, and the diners stayed open late because somebody was always hungry. But by the mid-1950s, the same progress that once built America's highways was about to change everything. And not in a way the old road could survive. In 1956, President Eisenhower signed the Interstate Highway Act, a plan to knit the country together with straight, wide, high-speed roads modeled after Germany's Autobahn system he'd seen during the war. The idea made sense on paper. Safer, faster routes for commerce and defense. But for the little towns that depended on Route 66, those new concrete ribbons were like silent detours around their entire way of life. When the interstates came, they didn't follow the old road, they replaced it. Engineers drew their lines to be efficient, not scenic. Instead of weaving through small towns, they cut straight across the plains and deserts, skirting everything that once made the Mother Road special. Motels, gas stations, and cafes that had lived off the rhythm of passing headlights suddenly found themselves staring at empty pavement. In Seligman, Arizona, old-timers remember the change like a switch being flipped. One morning, the roar of engines just stopped. The new I-40 bypassed town entirely, and the stream of travelers that had fed generations of small businesses vanished overnight. Main Street looked the same, but the life had gone out of it. A few stubborn locals painted new signs and tried to hold on, but the world had moved a few miles north, and it wasn't coming back. Further east, along the border of Texas and New Mexico, the tiny town of Glen Rio suffered the same fate. For decades, it had been a perfect halfway stop, a gas station on one side of the state line, a motel on the other. Then I-40 came through, a few miles away. Within weeks, the pumps were dry, the motel empty, and the town silent. Today, it's a ghost, a single stretch of cracked concrete, where the only travelers are tumbleweeds and memories. Even the bigger towns weren't spared. Tucumcari, New Mexico, once had a neon sign that promised 2,000 motel rooms. It was a beacon for tired families crossing the desert. But when the bypass opened, traffic dropped by half, and within a few years, most of those motels had closed. The signs still glowed for a while, buzzing in the dark, advertising rooms no one would ever sleep in again. Everywhere you looked, you could find the same story. Cafe owners locking their doors for the last time. Mechanics closing their garages because no one was breaking down on their stretch of road anymore. Kids leaving town because there was no work left to stay for. The bright, humming artery that once connected the country became a slow pulse, then a heartbeat fading into silence. You can still hear the way people talk about it, not with anger, but with that kind of soft disbelief reserved for something you thought would never end. One motel owner in Oklahoma said, "It was like somebody picked up our town and moved it 10 miles away." Progress had done what the Dust Bowl, the Depression, and 2 world wars couldn't. It emptied the mother road. The neon signs dimmed, the paint peeled, and the weeds came through the cracks. Cars still drove west, but now they were speeding past the exits, not stopping for pie or postcards. By the 1970s, most of Route 66 had been replaced entirely, chopped into local access roads and frontage lanes, no longer even listed on maps. But the funny thing about roads is that even when they fade from the highway signs, they don't fade from the heart. Because while the rest of the world moved on to the interstates, a few towns, you and a few dreamers, refused to let that story end there. By the late 1970s, the old road looked tired. Pavement cracked where the desert heat had its way. Gas pumps rusted shut with weeds growing through their bases. The same motels that once promised air conditioning and color TV now stood faded and silent, their doors swinging in the wind. Route 66 hadn't disappeared yet, but it was getting hard to tell it was still alive. Traffic had long since shifted to the new interstates. Families no longer rolled in at dusk, headlights glowing through the dust. Even the truckers had moved on. In some places, the highway just ended, swallowed by bypasses or washed out by time. The once mighty artery of America's westward dream had become a collection of dead ends. In 1985, the government made it official. Route 66 was decommissioned. The signs came down. On paper, it didn't exist anymore. Its fragments were divided among state and county roads, renamed and renumbered. A bureaucratic erasure of one of the most famous highways in the world. For a generation, the Mother Road vanished from maps and memory alike. New travelers zipped down the I-40, never knowing they were a few miles from the towns that once made America move. Schools stopped teaching it. Kids grew up without ever hearing the name. But even in its quietest years, life never completely left it. In a few stubborn corners, a diner here, a motor court there, people kept the lights on. They served coffee to locals, flipped pancakes for whoever wandered in, and refused to believe that the story was over. Some painted new historic 66 signs themselves. Others just stayed open out of habit, the same way their parents had. And if you happened to stop by, if you turned off the interstate and followed the cracked road for a while, You'd find something the maps had forgotten. The sound of a screen door closing, the smell of bacon in the air, and a waitress who'd smile and say, "You're not lost. You're right where you're supposed to be." For a while, it looked like Route 66 would stay buried under weeds and memories. But then something unexpected happened. The same generation that had watched it fade began to miss it. By the early 1990s, car clubs, historians, and local volunteers started digging up the past, repainting faded murals, relighting old neon, and fighting to get those famous highway shields back on the poles. They called it Historic Route 66, and somehow that one word, historic, made all the difference. It wasn't just an old road anymore. It was a living museum, a story you could still drive through. Travelers came from all over the world to feel a piece of that American promise, to see the diners, motels, and gas stations that had once kept the nation moving. Small towns that had nearly died found new reasons to live. In California's Mojave Desert, the ghostly Roy's Motel and Café flickered back to life, its neon once again cutting through the dark. Across the highway, the black dome of Amboy Crater became a favorite backdrop for photographers chasing that endless empty beauty. Filmmakers rolled in with cameras. Route 66 festivals sprang up in Oklahoma and Illinois, with old cars gleaming in the sun and bands playing songs that still smelled faintly of gasoline and dust. Bikers from Europe and Japan traced the old route end to end, riding it like a pilgrimage. For them, it wasn't just a road. It was the feeling of freedom America once sold to the world. Today, Route 66 is quieter than it was in its glory days, but it's not silent. You can still follow its twists through the high desert and the plains, past the diners that survived and the ones that didn't. The paint may be faded, but the spirit's still strong. If you listen closely with the windows down, you can still hear it. The echo of engines, laughter, and all the people who once pointed west and believed that tomorrow was waiting just down the road.